Maserati is proud to partner with Monocle Culture on Monocle Radio. Monocle Culture is taking to the road to mark the birth of Maserati's extraordinary Gran Cabrio Folgore. Folgore, it means lightning. To badge its all-electric offering, the marque has embraced the excitement of the elemental to power a thrilling future. And it's an adventure that our team was delighted to join. You can hear how the journey begins by tuning into the first of two very special episodes of Monocle Culture premiering this September. So join us as we strap ourselves into the Maserati Gran Cabrio Folgore for an unforgettable road trip, starting off at the marque's iconic Modena home. Monocle Culture's Maserati road trip, coming soon to Monocle Radio.
Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture with me, Robert Bounds. Today I'm talking to the author David Peace about his new book Munichs, which is a novelisation of the infamous Munich air disaster of February the 6th, 1958, in which 21 passengers died instantly on a snowy Bavarian runway. That included 8 footballers and 3 staff members of an era-defining Manchester United football team known after their manager and for their youth as the Busby Babes. The other dead were crew of the BA aeroplane and some of the best-known sports writers in Britain. The crash made world headlines at the time. The immediate grief struck families and communities across England and in Ireland, from which one of United's brightest hopes hailed, while the aftershock affected the tone and perhaps tone of voice of a nation still reeling from a 20th century of horrors and shocks. Peace's novel offers biography on the victims, explores family grief, describes community and gives voice to the previously underreported and unvoiced, all against the backdrop of the survivors' attempts to get well, make sense of the crash and the loss of loved ones and teammates. Of course, sport rarely stops, and so a team must be picked in a busy season of fixtures. Will these faces, young but haggard from the wreckage, or new, green and untested, make the grade, or simply stay sane? Peace, the well-loved author of the Red Riding Quartet, as well as a Tokyo trilogy and 2 other football books, The Damned United and Red or Dead, has written an incredible, patient, polyphonic and tender novel that weaves 100 strands together to form a stunning picture of stoicism, sadness, strength, and perhaps qualities that defined an era long gone. To put all this in a little context, we asked David to read an excerpt from Munichs. At this point, the then Manchester United apprentice Nobby Stiles, who later went on to feature in England's 1966 World Cup winning team, is fixated on the talismanic nature of Tommy Taylor's football boots. Tommy had died in the crash and Nobby was taking care of them. Here's David Peace.
Nobby believed in miracles, he really did. He was an apprentice at Manchester United for a start, clearing the snow from the pitch, cleaning up the washrooms and the gym, yes, but playing in the FA Youth Cup and in the practice matches too. All those practice matches with the reserves and the first team boys. But every night, before he said his prayers and went to sleep, Nobby would go under his bed and get out Tommy Taylor's boots from there. Wrapped up in a cloth they were, and Nobby would look at them, he would stare at them, wipe off any speck of dust on them, then Nobby would say a prayer or 2 on them, very special prayers, before he wrapped them back up again, put them under his bed again, then he'd kneel down beside his bed and finish off his prayers. That night, before the semi-final replay of the FA Cup, when Nobby had gone under his bed for Tommy's boots, they were not there. They were not there. He looked and looked, he searched and searched, but they were not there. They'd gone. He couldn't find them anywhere. But that next day, that afternoon, United won. They beat Fulham 5-3. Were in the final of the FA Cup, and when Nobby got back home that night, went up the stairs, looked under his bed again, there they were, back where they always were, and Nobby's heart, it raced and raced to think what this could mean. It was a miracle. These were holy magic boots, they really were Tommy Taylor's boots, and Nobby wanted to tell the whole world about the miracle of Tommy Taylor's boots, how they had disappeared, gone off down to London, helped Alex Dawson score a hat-trick, helped Shea and Bobby Charlton score 2, but when Nobby went and first told his brother Charlie, he just laughed and said, "You're as blind as a fucking bat, you are, they'll have been there all the time." So after that, Nobby never told a soul, a living soul, but Nobby knew what he had seen or not had seen, and so Nobby knew what he believed.
Thank you very much, David. Some magical realism delivered through the consciousness of the young Nobby Stiles there. And here is my conversation with David Peace. And David joins us now. David, congratulations on Munichs. It's an absolutely wonderful book. And I wanted actually to start with the title first, because you look at that in your sort of afterword.
Right, yeah.
But people can, it's no spoiler, to tell people what that consists of. So yeah, for the uninitiated, tell us who Munichs are.
This novel is a novel about the Munich air disaster of 1958, in which many members of the famous Busby Babes Manchester United team were killed, as well as 8 journalists and staff of Manchester United, and also some of the crew of the plane. It was a national tragedy. It was something that affected the whole country. It was worldwide news. It was on the front of the New York Times. And I think this is a little bit lost. And I wanted to really convey the scale of the tragedy and the impact it had on Britain at that time. And so it was important for me then to have as many voices represented, so there are the voices of the players who survived the crash, beginning with the crash, the players, the goalkeeper Harry Gregg, the defender Bill Foulkes, most famously Bobby Charlton. Of course, Matt Busby was critically injured and then he's taken to hospital. And then there are the people back home, for example, Cissy Charlton, Bobby's mother, Jean Busby, Busby's wife, and one of the key characters is Jimmy Murphy, who was the assistant manager to Busby and who really by a quirk of fate was not on the plane. And it was then down to him and to the staff that were left at Old Trafford to carry on the team, to take them forward. And in order to kind of represent the scale of this disaster and all these different people, it was important that the novel was a polyphonic novel, like many voices, and for those voices to be as unique and as easily distinguishable for the reader, to not confuse them. And so Munichs, has a,
as you addressed in the epilogue, it's a pejorative term.
Well,
it's
this
been
was
used
it.
as
So
that,
I had arrived at, I knew that Munichs, for the meaning of the book and the theme of the book and the multiplicity of this tragedy, the way it affected so many people, was important. But I also knew that it was, growing up in West Yorkshire, I knew that it was a term that, like, some Leeds fans used as a term of a mockery or abuse about United fans. And there were also terrible chants growing. I mean, there are terrible chants about Munich and so forth. And so it was a difficult decision because, I don't seek really to provoke, and particularly I wouldn't, I'm not aiming to kind of provoke and annoy the Manchester United supporters, but I would defy anybody to read this book and to then ever use the term Munichs as a term of abuse or mockery. And I also think, and this is easy for me to say when I don't support United, I mean, I think it's a term, if I were United, if I was a United supporter, I would wear the badge of Munich proudly, because it is the thing that distinguishes United from other clubs, and particularly the way that they triumphed over the tragedy. So the book is a lot about, is a lot about the disaster, a lot about the grief, and the funerals are covered and so forth. But it is also about how Jimmy Murphy and the staff and the younger players, they rallied and actually incredibly went on a run to the FA Cup final. In 3 months after Munich, they were in the final of the FA Cup. And I think that part of the story is often forgotten for people outside of a Manchester United fan base.
Yeah. No, I mean, using the title Munichs for the book, and you saying, David, that you hope you're not trying to annoy any Man United fans. I mean, I think this will become a cherished set text for Manchester United fans.
I hope
and general
so,
football fans the world over.
And I also hope that it crosses over to people who don't support United. I mean, I've had friends of mine who are a lot of friends of mine actually support Liverpool, and they've read proofs of this and then written, I can't believe you made me feel sorry for United. And I think it speaks to also, a lot of the book, I have to, just to digress, a lot of the book was in a way about my own relationship with my father, because my father, my grandfather, my father, myself, we all Huddersfield Town supporters.
My father as well. He'd be very proud.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Well, but the team that my father spoke about the most was the Busby Babes, who he'd seen, first of all, when he was 16, and then in 1958, he'd moved down to Teacher Training College in Chelsea, and And he was having the time of his life because he had like access to so much football and cricket and classical music and things he loved. And he went to Highbury. He was at Highbury, which was, of course, the last game that United played before they flew
it's a
to
sort of
Belgrade.
magic talismanic match, isn't it? Wasn't it?
Yeah. And he always said it was the greatest game he'd ever seen, and it's the game that begins the book. And so I kind of grew up kind of steeped in this kind of like, him talking about the babes and about the disaster, and also about the journalists who died, because I think another thing that's perhaps hard for us to recognise now is that the 8 journalists who died, they were household names in their own right. In fact, the biggest funeral in Manchester after Munich was not one of the footballers. It was Henry Rose.
You draw wonderful pictures of these journalists as well, and the way that they ply their trade, the kind of community of sports writers as well, and how, as you say, they were sort of front and centre.
Yeah.
They would have been reporting on this if they weren't involved in it. And
Yeah.
Henry Rose is a larger-than-life character. His copy also was that. And there's such a rich bibliography in the back. I feel like you've read every book in order to dive into these characters.
I must say, I've read the parts of the book that were relevant to. I mean, some of the books I've read from cover to cover.
By the way, I should say that David Peace is in the studio looking askance at my copy, my beautiful copy, beautifully bound by Faber and Faber, with all the dog-eared pages in it.
It's that to me is the biggest compliment. No, it's the biggest compliment. That's what most of the books in my office look like. Yeah. The books that I used for Munichs all look like that, because that's that's an important part to me of reading, is that kind of process, the note taking and so forth.
This is such a beautiful, original, and as you say, polyphonic work, David. I wondered if it was almost an inevitable book for you to write, that you've written about with your Red Riding trilogy and then your Tokyo books, the sort of processing of trauma and events. And then you've obviously written The Damned United and Red or Dead. Yeah. So in the football realm, very much. I wondered if this felt, I mean, as you talked about your relationship with your father, and perhaps it was a cathartic thing for that as well. But was there an inevitability somehow to write in this book?
It feels like that now, but I wasn't,
right.
But it wasn't,
Not when you're halfway through.
I came, so my father passed away in May 2022, which, he'd had vascular dementia. So in the end, to be honest, it was a relief that that he passed in the end, really, when he did. But I came back then from Yorkshire to Tokyo, and I was writing, as I have been for many years now, a book about Harold Wilson. And actually about Harold Wilson and Huddersfield Town, because he was a great Huddersfield Town sport. But I couldn't really pick it up, and I realised that I wanted to write this book, which I think was a way to, I think it was a way of keeping the conversation going with my father, because, we didn't just talk about football, but we certainly spoke about it a lot.
Was it the conversation you could have, which was a thinly disguised metaphor for other things you were trying to say? Or?
Well, I would like to think so, but perhaps not. We spoke 2 or 3 times a week, but a lot of it was about football, and this was a kind of way to keep that conversation going. And we had, I'd had various ideas about writing about Bobby Charlton. And also, in retrospect, it's interesting how the books, the free football books, do link, because in The Damned United, Brian Clough leads out at the Charity Shield in 1974, and the other manager leading out Liverpool is Bill Shankly, who was retired. So Shankly features in The Damned United, and then in Red or Dead, Matt Busby features quite a lot in Red or Dead, because Bill Shankly was a friend of Matt Busby's and actually really admired and looked up to him as a mentor. So they kind of each book sort of suggests the next book, really.
Yeah.
But Munichs began, the initial idea back in the summer of 2022 was that it would be a kind of novel of tales, which is the format I'd used for Patient X, the book about the Japanese writer Akutagawa, where using a series of short stories to tell the life of Akutagawa. And I was quite taken with that kind of format, and I had the idea of a series of short stories about Manchester United, a bit same a model of Dubliners in my mind by Joyce. But when I began to do the research for the Munich air disaster, I just thought it's just not possible I can't tell this story in such a, no, I mean it's I think it was when I realised what Jimmy Murphy had done, really, in taking United to that FA Cup final. As I said, my dad talked about it a lot, but I hadn't really comprehended all that Murphy had done in the wake of the crash, and I also hadn't really comprehended the extent to which this disaster was a national tragedy, not something that just affected Manchester and United.
I'd like to discuss the sort of national and international ramifications of it, and its ramifications for the tone of football and how football is reported and how fans treat each other and things like that. But first, I wanted just to ask you about, you mentioned Jean Busby, Cissy Charlton, Bobby and Jack's mother, and we get inside the head of Jimmy Murphy. And very movingly, I love the section in Dublin with Liam Whelan's family and how it's so beautifully written, it's so beautifully realised, his life, his young life, and that of his family in Dublin. I wondered if you were trying to give voice to the kind of previously unvoiced. I know Cissy Charlton's written a memoir, and only through reading your bibliography and things, there is a certain amount of giving voice to the unvoiced and giving an imaginative world to people that have been underreported.
Yes, I felt that it was really, really important to have the voices of, the relatives of the victims and also the dead. And for example, Duncan Edwards' mother and father, who were destroyed by what happened. Yeah, because I also think that they, for example, in different ways, that Cissy Charlton and Jean Busby, represented, they were, Cissy Charlton, she first of all she believes that Bobby's died in the crash, and the minute she realises he hasn't, her first instinct is to
start with a premonition at the beginning of the book.
But she thinks that he's died, and because news obviously comes through, in those days much more slowly, and there's a knock on the door and there's a policeman there, and she thinks it's the worst possible news. But as soon as she knows that he's not dead, her first instinct is to then get the train over to Old Trafford to help. And Jean Busby, who again thinks that Matt has died, as soon as she knows that he's not, her first instinct is for the friends who had her friends who've lost their husbands, in the crash. And I think I thought that, and also, of course, the wives of the other players who died, and the sisters, mothers, and so forth. And I felt this was, really, really important to have those voices there. I mean, the one thing that also struck me that I hadn't realised, really before going into the book, was the extent to which people were helped by their faith and their religion. This is 1958. It's not that long ago. People were, I think, for example, with Jimmy Murphy, with Jean Busby, with many of the people, their faith helped them deal with the grief a great deal.
Yeah. In your book, David, it gives structure to these huge funeral corteges where there is a focal point at the end of that cortege, which is the church, or in Henry Rose's case, the synagogue. And I found that moving, actually. And maybe this is the right time to talk about the tonal shift that I think you may be pointing to, and the coarsening of the discourse around football and around grief itself and around tragedy. Yeah. Because soon after this restructured, restaffed United team start winning, after the crash with Jimmy Murphy in charge and some of these new players drafted in, a lot of some other teams and some other fans are accusing them of surfing on sympathy. And, people are getting hate mail and, and all this kind of stuff. And I wondered, it seems like you're talking about a tonal shift in the way that we talk about grief in football. I wondered about that.
Yeah, no, and I think it was one of the things, though, that really, I was quite surprised, actually, that, even so soon after the disaster, that, there were letters into newspapers saying that the country, the outpouring of grief, the country had gone hysterical, that it had lost its mind, that this wasn't the British way, and so forth. Actually, very reminiscent of some of the letters and comments that were made after the death of Princess Diana. And again, it shows the way in which, to some extent, Munich as a national tragedy, and you might say the same about Aberfan as well. How these. It's interesting. They're often very working class tragedies. They're often erased from the public memory, and it was as if what happened around the outpouring of grief over Diana was something unprecedented, when actually it was something that had happened a couple of times before. But then to find that only weeks afterwards that when United, there's a scene in the book which is a true story, that when United were playing at Sunderland, some of the fans were shouting, Harry Gregg and Bobby Charlton, you should have died at Munich. Yeah.
And that, it's unthinkable, isn't it?
I know,
that fresh.
I know,
and just generally,
and also that the hate mail that Jim Fain, the pilot who survived. It took, that was another important part of the book, but it took him a very, very long time to clear his name. And again, the hate mail that not only he, but also his wife and kids received. And so the outpouring of initial grief and the fact that it transcended whether you supported United or not, whether you were interested in football or not, it really, really affected people, did the tragedy. And that was quite moving, the public expressions of grief and the sympathy for United. But at the same time, there was that kind of almost familiar kind of portent of what we're more used to, with the quick recourse to hate, really.
Did it feel like, you're not making this point explicitly in the book at all, I don't think, but does it feel like an inflection point, really, in the way that we process, the way that we treat our heroes or the heroes of other people's heroes, perhaps, or that we look at a tragedy like this? I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you're right. I mean, it's amazing that also you mentioned Aberfan, which was a similar kind of thing.
Yeah, I do think it was a pivotal moment, and I think that was a big part of writing the book, was the fact that I think it's a sort of, most people who are interested in football know of the Munich disaster. And United, every February, the first game of the season, they have the commemorations and so forth. And if you go to Old Trafford, there's a Munich clock, the Munich tunnel and so forth. And of course, they rightly remember it, and all United fans know about it. But I felt that maybe the wider footballing community and the wider public had maybe lost sight of the fact that it was a national tragedy and was something that affected people very, 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 very deeply. And I think it's hard to, though, unpick it, because to some degree, the Busby Babes, before the disaster, were already a symptom of a changing football. They were like the proto-celebrity footballers we know now.
And also they were the Busby Babes because they were all in their late teens or early 20s.
Exactly.
They were super young. They were a bit galactico-like.
They really were. And there was... And there was a degree of resentment towards United. I mean, they were known as kind of Hollywood United before the crash, and that's the reason, for example, that Duncan Edwards, who was born in Dudley, but he didn't go to play for Wolves, and that Bobby Charlton, who should have gone to Newcastle, that they both came to Manchester United because of the allure of Manchester United then. And
imagine travelling so far from your hometown to play football.
Well, going back to what you said about Liam Whelan, for example, coming over from Dublin on the ferry and being homesick and so forth. But in the newspapers of the time, there were photo spreads of them in their communal digs, and they're kind of listening to records, doing the dishes and so forth. And there was a kind of image of them almost like some kind of Hard Day's Night kind of Beatles before the time, really. Yeah. And everyone remembers kind of David Beckham's various haircuts, but actually people followed what David Pegg's haircut was, and people went into barbers and asked for a David Pegg haircut, in 1958. So I think what's interesting is, yes, of course, 2024 is not 1958, but there are similarities and resonances, and you can see the paths that But I do think there was it seemed, and not to look back with nostalgic kind of rose-tinted glasses, but I think it was a kinder, softer time. I think also there was a kind of, the war had not ended that long ago. And I mean, at the time, some letters suggested that the outpouring of grief for Munich was some kind of delayed response to the deaths of so many young men in the war. And so I think there was something, it does seem a kind of a softer kinder. Yeah. And I think that, I suppose that, that just the greater sense of community.
Yeah, and that comes through in so many parts of this. None more so in the family life, and as you say, also a lot of these, not the Bobby Charltons of this world, but some of the players from some of the other teams, or some of the players that get drafted into United in these emergency post-crash measures. They're painters and decorators, or they're learning another trade to fall back on if they don't get picked for the team. These are the economic realities of their lives.
I mean, one of the things that Busby and Jimmy Murphy insisted on was that the players, when they came around about the age of 14 or 15 to United, but they had to learn a trade as well, in case they got injured or it didn't work out. And so that was a big part of their daily life. Nobby Stiles, who's only like 14 or 15,
and he's an apprentice, isn't he?
He's an apprentice, and his job is like cleaning the kit and the boots and taking the snow off the pitch and things, and like a grounds boy, really. But the massive enthusiasm and love for United that somebody like Nobby Stiles had, I mean, it was just, you would have done anything to be involved with United.
Yeah, and there's a name and a reputation afterwards to conjure.
I know. I mean, I do think though that one of the, again, things that gives you real pause is, when the coffins finally arrive back from Munich in Manchester, when they get to Old Trafford, it's these apprentices who then have to help carry the coffins into the gymnasium and lay them out. And I think there's
appear at people's funerals to be the Manchester United sort of man, really.
And
there were so many.
There's so many, and David Gaskill, who was the reserve team goalkeeper and was about 16, because he shared digs with Duncan Edwards, it was his job to box up all Duncan Edwards' possessions. And
that's heartbreaking.
I know. And it's just, and again, you think about, say, less than 2 weeks after the crash, Harry Gregg and Bill Foulkes are playing. Bobby Charlton not long after, literally they've walked away from plane crashes and are then running out at Old Trafford. And I mean, that, I think nowadays we would, balk at that.
Yeah.
There will be a lot more support.
Yeah. And you talking of the dead, they start off lowercase and they end up uppercase at a certain point in the book, David. And they are the youth, and there's the kind of Flower of England vibe, a kind of 1914, Verdun kind of vibe to it as well. And that, as you say, there's this kind of might be this delayed response to the wars of the 20th century that is born out in the aftermath of this as well. There seems to be, I mean, that is just a general psychological wash through the book. Yeah. There is people are used to tragedy, used to dealing with huge grief, huge travails, and again, maybe this is to do with the time and the sense of community, but they seem to be processing huge amounts of grief in the most homespun language, in the sort of make do and mend attitude of the time, I suppose, which I found really moving and really beautiful. Even Matt Busby, who was quite a grand man in the era, it's like, it's not too bad, love, and it looks like it might be sunny later. I'll see if I can get out of my hospital room. And it's quite very demure and kind of something very tender about it.
And I think that again was something that all these scenes are suggested by things that I've read, or listened to the people's recollections from the time and so forth. And that, again, I think, like, going back to the, Jimmy Murphy and Matt Busby had been in the war, they'd served and so forth, and I think that gave them that sense that you had to just kind of get on with it, and kind of it was like, so it's a kind of understated. I think that also the kind of negative side of that is, I think that meant that they kind of projected that on, like, Harry Gregg and Bill Foulkes and Bobby Charlton, that you just have to get onto it. I mean, Jimmy Murphy brings Harry Gregg and Bill Foulkes back from Munich on a train journey and then a ferry, because nobody obviously wants to fly again. And on the ferry, Jimmy Murphy tells Bill Foulkes that he has to be the captain, that he has to play in the next game, and and it's just, that's what he has to do. Yeah. And obviously the absolute last thing that Bill Foulkes wants to do is to play football.
Yeah, and this also, and Bobby Charlton as well. Yes. And there's a wonderful part in the book which is illustrated on the cover photograph actually, of Bobby Charlton in the backs in Newcastle, I guess. Yeah, he's back at home under Sissy's roof. Yes, and she's constantly trying to persuade him back out to play. Yeah. And then one of his old mates, who's maybe he's a reserve team player or something, coaxes him out, and they jumpers for goalposts, snow on the ground, and it's the habit of kicking the ball, the joy of doing it with an old schoolmate, almost like they are school children again. Brings him back and kind of soothes his, if not his worry. It doesn't placate him of all the worries.
No, I mean, it's what was interesting about this period when Bobby Charlton came back to Ashington. It was that there are various accounts of this. There's the account Sissy Charlton gives, there's the account Jack Charlton gives, and then there's actually a few slightly contradictory accounts that Bobby Charlton gave of this time. Because, I mean, obviously he's not, he's a traumatised. So he actually claimed that he never really thought he wouldn't play football again. I think it was just a question of the timing, and I think. There is one anecdote that he goes to when he has the stitches out, that he's sent to the local doctor, and the local doctor tells him that, when I was in the war, I lost all these friends, and, I didn't want to go back up, he was a pilot, but then I just went up, you have to go, and you have to fly again, and you will do so and things. Now, and actually, that story was so prevalent that actually the doctor appeared when Bobby Charlton was on This Is Your Life, and you can see this on YouTube, and it's excruciating because it's the last thing that Bobby Charlton wants to. This is 10 years after, but he does not want to be there. The doctor comes out and tells the story, but later Bobby Charlton says that's not true. It's like this just didn't happen. But actually, it was sitting in the pub with his dad, And they started to talk about the Sheffield Wednesday fixture that was coming up, and the fact that Ernie Taylor, who was a local hero, had gone to play, Manchester, Jimmy Murphy had signed him, and that he realised that Bobby Charlton just realised he wanted to be at that game. And when he went to that game as a spectator and sat with Jimmy Murphy, he realised that what he needed to do, and the only way to get over this, was to actually start playing again. And then, of course, his friend comes round and they have a kickabout and so forth. The thing that knocks him back, though, of course, is that, his great friend was Duncan Edwards. And one of the most painful parts of Munich is the fact that, like, Duncan Edwards hung on for life for so long. And this was every day, the papers, twice a day, morning editions, evening editions were reporting on his status. And when Duncan finally succumbs, that knocks Bobby back again. And so that delays his return. I mean, these are just, it's just incredible to think that Bobby Charlton actually ever came back from that, and let alone to have the career that he did. And I think that he was motivated entirely, really, by playing for friends that he'd lost, and to not squander that time.
Well, it's beautifully put down in Munichs, David. I mean, it's in so many things, and I feel that the imaginative world that you've created for these people that are not unreported, but maybe are getting lost somewhere in the midst of time and memory, apart from for the most hardcore United fans, I suppose, with long memories and a lot of books. This reanimates it so beautifully, but without any prurience. And I guess it's critical of some of the prurience of the press and of some of the, as I say, the coarsening of some of the discourse around it. Yeah. But it's a beautiful, super moving book. Thank you, David.
Thanks.
My thanks to David Peace for that conversation about Munichs, which is out now, published by Faber and Faber. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chung-Gu. Steph also edits the show. We'll be back with more next week, but for now, from me, Robert Bound, thank you for tuning in.